Good evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we are coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the airways of WNYE 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday evening and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. I'm very, very pleased to have on the telephone with me this evening Kiese Laymon. Welcome, Kiese.
Thank you for having me, Professor Greene. I'm happy to be here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I want to first thank my engineer, Fritz Richardson, for always being there and being the production engineer. I also want to acknowledge that, or just inform our audience that our theme music is very, very relevant. It's by Gary Bart's I've Known Rivers. And I chose that because, of course, that's the testament to Langston Hughes. And when we talk about writers and bringing writing and music and the arts together, Gary Bartz is someone who epitomizes that. So that's part of why we've made that our theme music. But we're here to talk about a very interesting book of essays compiled by Kiese Laymon. And we're going to talk about some of the issues he raises in those essays, which are really, really very relevant and topical today, and really speak to what it means to be a black man in these United States of America. But first, a little bit of information about Kiese Laymon. I like that name. Was born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi. He graduated from Oberlin College and earned his MFA from Indiana University. He is a contributing editor at Gawker.com and has written for numerous publications, including Esquire and ESPN.com. He is Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at Vassar College. His first novel, Long Division, was published by Agate Bolden in June 2013. And his most recent book is How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America. Essays, very powerful essays. So again, thank you. Thank you for writing this. And before we get into the discussion, Mark Anthony Neal calls Kiese Laymon one of the leading young black writers in America. Roxanne Gay said, when I first encountered Kiese Laymon's writing, when I read How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, A Remembrance, I was stunned into stillness. And the Michigan Quarterly Review calls this book an amazing, courageous, and brave novelist and essayist. So we are very excited about what you've done. So why don't we start by, why don't you talk about what was your motivation to write this book of essays, and just kind of share with the audience the theme, how you came into this title, How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America.
Okay, yeah, thanks again for having me. I started writing the book of essays really around the time when my uncle was not doing so well. My uncle, it was the only other man in my immediate family. I was raised by my mother and my grandmother, my aunt, and my Uncle Jimmy was around. And, he just had a hard time with life. And one day my grandmother found him, went to his house, knocked on his door, he didn't answer the phone. He moved back down to Mississippi from Illinois, and he didn't answer the door because he was dead. And my grandmother just broke, and my grandmother raised all of us, and hearing her break and seeing the reflection of myself and my uncle kind of encouraged and inspired me to write what I, at the time, felt like an honest book about the ways that we allow things like structural racism, anti-blackness, patriarchy to kind of dictate, a lot of how we move, but also just I wanted to write like a personal book about the ways that we sometimes fight and lose, or sometimes we encourage a lot of those things that are structural, that are kind of out to get us. And I just wanted to write to my uncle, I wanted to write to my grandmother, I wanted to write to my mom, and I wanted to write to other, particularly like black, youngish black men in my life about what was happening to us and what we might do going forward to be a little bit better at this living thing.
Right. Now you in writing this book, you were drawing from your own experiences, but it felt like you were writing to other writers. It felt like a ongoing conversation that begins with people like Baldwin and Richard Wright and continues with people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and M.K. Asante, people who are writing what it's like to be a black male in America, but also those novels and those essays that speak to this condition. Who are the people who are influencing you? And would you say you were consciously thinking about others who have written on these subjects?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I teach a Baldwin class, and I've taught a Baldwin class for
What kind of class?
a class on Baldwin, James Baldwin,
Okay.
James Baldwin class. And, you know, when I was 19 or 18 years old, he had this short essay called Autobiographical Notes that I just read and reread and reread and reread. And then I read Notes of Native Son. I read Many Thousands Gone. I read The Fire Next Time. And, you know, for me, that was the first time I'd ever seen written language kind of work itself into the seams of like my life. Up until that point, you know, I had to read a lot. I read a ton. Um, Fiction really was the thing that got me. Tony K. Bambara language made me think I could write, but Baldwin made me think I could write, honestly. And then I started reading Audre Lorde a lot, and I was like, oh, there's another part of this living thing that I haven't really started to think and talk about, and that was kind of not just how hard it was to be a black male in this country, a black man in this country, but also the ways that like black men tend to make it hard for other people who identify as black women. Um, so like growing up, yeah, like I would say Baldwin, Tony K. Bambara, of course, Richard Wright, because I was from Jackson, was huge. And then there were just local writers that were just, you know, as formative in my life as like the larger canonical people. Margaret Walker Alexander was just absolutely huge. You know, I had to read a lot of Faulkner growing up, being in Mississippi, and I didn't love Faulkner, but I think reading Faulkner encouraged me to have like a critical stance towards traditional American literature, literary creation and production. Um, and then as I've gotten older, you know, I just think there's just so many writers that I think are doing it, that are pushing me to think and feel in ways that I might not want to think and push and feel. Jesmond Ward, who wrote so many incredible books, Men We Reap, Where the Line Bleeds, you know, she just showed me again that we who come from Mississippi could tell our particular truth, and we didn't have to dress it up as anything else but what it was. So, like, absolutely, I'm glad you see that. Like, the book is in conversation with, again, like a lot of the people that I've grown up with who are responsible for me, but it's also in conversation with the artists that I think are responsible for me. And then beyond the literary scope, I just think there's so many hip hop artists who I felt were speaking to me coming up. We were talking about this yesterday, you know, Mos and Talib and CeeLo and Andre 3000 and Lauryn Hill, and, you know, all of these people just, I felt like they were not just speaking to me, but they were speaking into what I call the creases of our lives that we're not supposed to interrogate. And that made me feel like it was possible for me to maybe just add my voice um, to a long list of primarily black folk out here just trying to speak ourselves into life and existence. And part of the way we do that is by talking about the things that also have encouraged us to die slowly.
Right. So just following up on that thing, speaking ourselves into life and existence speaks to the reason for choosing a title like How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America. But it also speaks to something that you wrote. I think you were writing to your uncle, and
Mhm.
you said, I'm just going to read it. And part of, and it's at the beginning of the book, you said, what makes me despicable is that one of the responsibilities of American writers is to broaden the confines, sensibilities, and generative capacity of American literature by broadening the audience to whom we write and hoping that broadened audience writes back with brutal imagination, magic, and brilliance. And you were talking about the responsibility that writers have. Can you speak a little bit more to that? The responsibility of writers. I mean, you talked about the people who've influenced you, but what responsibilities do you have as a writer? Because one of the things I thought about is you also talking about exploding. I'm using exploding in quotes, or exploring, or expanding the canon of what we call American literature.
Yeah, Baldwin talked about how writers had a responsibility of witnessing and re-examining all of the cultural mores we've been told are true, right? So I believe that, but I think it's hard to do that if you don't broaden your audience beyond the audience that we are taught as writers should be our primary audience, meaning white normative um, elite man. Really, we're taught in so many ways that those are the people who control the publishing industry. Those are the those are the people you're supposed to write to. I'm working on this new book right now, and I'm thinking about uh, the teachers that I had growing up, and these were teachers who were black, white. I didn't have any Latino teachers, but they were black and white, and for the most part, they kept on encouraging us to do away with the voices that made us, right? So we were never supposed to write to a lot of the people and or voices that made us. We were supposed if we were supposed to write in Mississippi, even we were supposed to write to this normative white man and maybe convince him of I don't know what. And so, you're supposed to, and I understand why we have to master the King's English and all that kind of stuff. And I think that that's really important. I think knowing the rules of English literature and language are crucial. But for me, one of the goals of as a black writer, but definitely a American writer in general, is that I want to try to write to people who haven't been written to, because there's large parts of me, large parts of my identity that aren't written to. I want to try to write to those people with the understanding that you don't dumb down to write to folk who don't read. It actually takes a lot more mastery of form and mastery of punctuation, mastery of syllables and sounds to write to folk who don't read. And so that's what I'm trying to call for in that initial essay in the book. I'm saying, if we write to those parts of our identity, write to those parts of our community, there's more likelihood that those parts of our identity, those parts of our community are going to write back. And that's the echo I'm trying to talk about. And I know that because, again, I remember the first time I felt written to when I read Toni Cade Bambara's work. I was like, oh my God, like this is a woman who didn't know me, but she imagined me, and she's writing two parts that made me, and very few other things were writing to that part of me.
Do you remember which book that really impressed you by her?
Yeah, I mean, she used not just the rhythms of the life that I lived, but she used words and humor and particular kinds of intellect and like references, and she brought secondary characters to life in this way that I hadn't seen. And again, my mother was a teacher, so I had to read a lot coming up. But it made me realize that like I could, you know, it made me really ultimately unafraid of the page. And I think for so many young black folk in this country and brown folk too, and a lot of white folk too, like I think there's a fear of the page. And one of the things that my mother taught me, because she was a teacher and because of some of the books that I felt an affinity to, it's like I was no longer afraid of that white page, and I wasn't afraid of books. You know what I mean? Like I realized that books were composed and comprised of millions of paragraphs and trillions of sentences, and all of those sentences weren't great sentences, but like I could add my sentences and paragraphs to the mix, and I had every right to. And I just think that comes from being written to. That comes from this feeling of, oh, somebody wrote to me. So I wanted to give I wanted to write to the greats who made me possible. I wanted to write to my mom. I wanted to write to my aunt, but also wanted to write to those parts of myself and the readers in our community and potential readers in our community that aren't written to at all.
Yeah, that's that you speak to the whole theme of the importance of legacy too, of telling our stories, and as you said, of writing to those people who normally would not read our stories. But this was a particular journey that you had. You didn't come to this easily. On in one part of your book you say, I know that as I got deeper into my late 20s and then my 30s, I managed to continue killing myself and other folks who love me in spite of me. So you had a challenging journey, and you made a turn. You are now teaching at Vassar. You're visiting professor at the University of Mississippi, I believe.
Uh-huh.
What was it that turned you? What was that journey like? How did you get break the cycle that so many people have? Although your as you said, your mother was a teacher, but you were still headed down another path.
Yeah, my mother being a teacher helped me. It gave me a particular set of tools that I wouldn't have had were my mother not a teacher. But the truth is that a lot of my mother's colleagues had who were older and were married. My mother was, she raised me by herself. She wasn't. I mean, she raised me without a husband. She didn't raise me by herself. My
Right.
community and my
It,
grandmother,
it,
my aunts helped.
it always takes a village, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But and the thing about my mother raising me is interesting is that she was the youngest. She was one of the younger professors at Jackson State while she was there. And she had me when she was 19, and she started teaching at Jackson State in 79, and she was like 25 or 26, and so she was teaching in an institution right next to people who had taught her. So her colleagues were at one point her professors, but a lot of her colleagues had sons, had daughters that just didn't make it. A lot of them got incarcerated. A few of them are dead. And so her being a teacher in some ways gave me particular tools other people didn't have, but it didn't necessarily protect me from everything, right?
Right.
And so
That cuts
I say this
across
in the book,
class.
I tell anybody who listens, that I think the thing that has saved me, and I don't think I'm like finally delivered, like I could, shit, who knows what will happen tomorrow? But my grandmother and the love of my grandmother is what brought me out when I was deepest. Like when I was in college, I got kicked out of school for taking a library book out of a library, bringing it back and not checking it out. And the school wanted to get rid of me because of some of the things I was writing. You know, I felt like I let down my community. I felt like I let down my mother. I felt like I let down my grandmother. And the thing that like kept me going and pushed me to not hurt myself more and to kind of push beyond where I wanted to go was that my grandmother knew I was beautiful. I knew one person in the world loved me and knew I was beautiful and would do everything they could to fight for me. And I saw her fight for black folks her entire life. And that was my grandmother. And so, I'm one of those corny people who really believe that love is what saves us. Like the intellect and the education my mother gave me was crucial, but it was the love. It was the love of my grandmother. And meaning when I started to see my grandmother as not just a woman who happened to be my grandmother, but as this complicated woman who had to deal with all kind of structural violences, but who, in spite of all of that, pushed and loved and cared for so many children, so many grandchildren, so many people in our community, I just thought I had the responsibility to be like her.
Right. And that comes across in your book about it, this also being about the need for love and the need for us to give love to others and to also love ourselves.
Absolutely.
Right. So just switching up on the topics a little bit, one of the areas that you really talk a lot about is hip hop, the impact of hip hop and the geography of hip hip hop in the South versus hip hop in the North. Can you talk a little bit about the the um, the whole concept about how geography ends up defining the way we come to music and how we interpret music and those influences?
Yeah, I grew up in the '80s, in the mid '80s, and I came of age. I became a teenager in the '80s, and for a lot of us, New York hip hop it gave us life. It gave us, a way to communicate to each other. We listened. We rapped to each other. We started writing our own lyrics. And what I talk about in the piece is that for the longest time, a lot of us were just imitating. We were not just imitating the rhyme patterns of MCs from New York. We were imitating some of what they were rhyming about. So even though none of us had ever been on a subway, we would rhyme. We put subways. You know what I'm saying? Even though
Right.
none of us knew what a bodega was, we would put words like bodega in our rhymes. And I remember, in the late 80s and early 90s, when I was about to finish high school in the early 90s, I remember there were just people, there was a few brothers at my school who were just like, in different language, they were just like, why do we keep on trying to imitate people who really don't necessarily know us, right? Like who have little love for us. Because like I was from the deep South, right? And a lot of those brothers who were rhyming up in New York had roots in Florida and North Carolina and all of that, but a lot of Caribbean influences. But people weren't really talking about the deep South, like, parts of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And I just remember I just remember it just happened. And when it happened so fast. All around my region, you started to hear young, mostly black men and some black women, rhyming in different rhyme patterns, like using words that were familiar to us.
Right. So you
And
help to validate that.
yeah, and it validated. And then we started to realize, if you go out to the West Coast, a lot of the rhymes that they were talking about, and it seems so small, but they were rhyming about riding in cars, and like you didn't hear a whole lot of like car rhymes out from the East Coast. And so we gravitated a lot more to that particular culture, I think in the early 90s, than we did to the East Coast. And what I'm trying to say in that book is that we so appreciate New York hip hop and New York artists, for giving us this art form to boast, to confess, and to critique, in so many ways. But it meant a lot for us to kind of define it for ourselves on our own terms. It just took a while.
I think that's a very important point because people tend to generalize about hip hop and the complexity. Is complex. There are geographical influences. Just another topic that you speak about is, and we're almost coming to a close, is the hypocrisy around in politics and around the people we arrest and the criminalization of black men and women versus whites. And you kind of refer to that. You see that among college students, the way the attitudes we have towards black men and women versus white men and women who are there's a double standard when it comes to who we arrest and the whole prison system and the drug culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, thank God it's been written about so exhaustively now.
Right.
Um, and the thing is, like, everybody I know has stories about, this is where I think the personal narrative and the structural narrative just need to consistently be told. And so, when I'm arrested, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do any of that stuff. But when I'm arrested for throwing crack out of a window, we need to understand, as I have been, and I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do any of that. But cops have stopped me when I've been in passenger seats and said that they saw crack come out of a window. And so we need to understand that is, that is the byproduct, right, of a system working exactly how it's supposed to work, and an educational system working exactly how it's supposed to work. So every time I'm stopped by police, the thing that always gets me is like, I know these police believe exactly, like they really believe I threw crack out of the window, right?
Right.
They really believe I probably have a gun, right? They really believe that I might be going to sell drugs,
Right.
and they don't believe it because they're police officers. They believe it because they're Americans.
Okay, so we have to bring this to a close. And as we close out, two things I want you to, in your closing statement, what is your writing process and what message do you have to young writers, to people who are writing? What is your writing process and what message do you have to our listeners and
My
to our
process
students?
is I write 2 hours in the morning, like 2 hours before I go to bed, and I'm committed to revision. And when I'm talking to young writers across the country, I want to encourage them to be innovative, But sometimes before you can be innovative, you have to really commit to revision. So the first draft of something you do, the second draft, the third, the fourth, the fifth draft of something you do is not as good as you think it is. It's, things that you write are not good because you wrote them. You have to revise them into excellence, and you build and you build. And I just want to encourage every young writer in the world to read as much as they can, to listen, and to revise exhaustively. That's right.
Thank you so much. And thank you for writing this book of really thought-provoking essays and sharing part of your own personal narrative to help us understand and help people in this country understand how we can avoid slowly killing ourselves in America. I've been speaking to Kiese Laymon, the author of How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, a book of essays. And he's also the author of an interesting novel, Long Division. And I encourage you to go out and purchase this book. It's something you will go back to. Gives you a lot of things to ponder. And I want to thank you for speaking with us, KS.
Thank you so much, Professor Greene. I just appreciate you and all you do. Thank you.
You're welcome. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. This has been Dr. Brenda Greene, Director of the National Black Writers Conference, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature, signing off, writers at mec.cumy.edu. Come back next week.
Next song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers, and we call this song I've Known Rivers.